Lecture 84, Conclusion.
In 1919, at the ripe old messianic age of 33, T.S. Eliot explained tradition as the content of the consciousness of the past. According to Eliot, tradition is not something you can inherit, but something you have to work for very hard. Knowing the past means cultivating what Eliot calls the historical sense, which in turn means understanding both the pastness and the presence of the past, the way it survives to permeate the present. A poet equipped with the historical sense, Eliot tells us, will not just feel his own generation inside him, but will also feel that everything of Western European literature, from Homer to our own time, makes up a coherent whole. Now, Eliot writes of what a poet should know about the history of literature, but his comments apply to everyone who hopes to understand it. As a man already steeped in literature, he knows how much work is required to take it in. You cannot escape that work if you want to know the great authors. You may inherit a library of 10,000 books, but you cannot inherit the knowledge of them. And though we live in an age of computer technology, we haven't yet figured out how to download a book into the human brain. Even lectures, such as those you've been listening to, can do no more than introduce you to great authors. To know their works, to develop a sense of what links one work to another, you have to read them. Fortunately, you don't have to take an examination on them. Nobody's going to test you now on the Mesopotamian epic of Gilgamesh or the book of Job or the development of tragedy in ancient Greece or the story of Beowulf or the plays of Lope de Vega. You may, of course, be able to say something about these topics now, and any time you want to review a particular lecture, you can play it again or read the printed outline of it. But even supposing you could memorize all of the lectures or just all of the outlines, what would you have? What would you know? Would you have anything more than the gist of each work in your head, lined up in sequence, one great work after another in the great march of literature? Is there any way of making coherent sense out of all this information, synthesizing it, grasping it as a whole? That's the question I want to pursue in this final lecture. We might begin by throwing out a hypothesis. Spread out over some 3,000 years, great works of literature not only tell a heap of different stories, but they also lay out an ongoing story about humankind's relation to God. The earliest works examined in this series include several books of the Old Testament, where God, or at least the idea of God, plays a major role in determining how men and women ought to lead their lives, why they are made to suffer, and what they can expect to gain as punishment for their sins or reward for their virtues in this life or the next. Unlike Scripture, classical literature paints a murky picture of the gods. In ancient Greek tragedy, for instance, the gods are multiple, quarrelsome, inscrutable, and capricious, sometimes absent, sometimes cruel, hardly ever dependable sources of justice and wisdom, let alone eternal salvation. But if we leapfrog our way to the 14th century, to 14th century Italy, Dante's Divine Comedy envisions a universe totally supervised by God, with every human being that has ever lived in it judged by eternal justice and carefully assigned a fitting place in paradise, purgatory, or hell. In Shakespeare's Hamlet, written in the early 17th century, justice is less categorical. Though Claudius would like to save his soul, he cannot pray for salvation because he cannot bring himself to give up a throne that he gained by murder. And when Hamlet kills Claudius, we don't know for sure whether or not he's doing the work of God. But God's justice is precisely what Milton exhibits later in the 17th century in Paradise Lost. There he audaciously fuses classical mythology with the whole of the Judeo-Christian tradition under the sign of divine providence. In this mighty epic, Milton not only rewrites the book of Genesis, he sketches a history of humankind that stretches all the way from pre-creation to the second coming of Christ. In so doing, he aims, as he says at the very beginning of the poem, he aims to justify the ways of God to man, to show that the wisdom and justice and mercy of God will ultimately triumph over all the evil of Satan and all the sufferings and woes of humankind. To view Milton's epic from the vantage point of our own time is to realize that literature no longer feeds on his kind of faith. And to read the novels of the 19th and 20th centuries is to see that they gradually trace the disappearance of God, or at least of any real faith in divine providence. In Melville's Moby Dick, published right in the middle of the 19th century, the captivatingly audacious hero breathes the fire of diabolic defiance. In Dickens's Great Expectations, published 10 years later, the self-sacrificing Magwitch is finally sentenced to die, and we have no assurance that his noble service to Pip will bring him any reward at all in the life to come. In Thomas Hardy's Test of the D'Urbervilles, published in 1891, the world of the heroine is governed not by the foresight and benevolence of God, but by chance, the cruel indifference of fate. And in Albert Camus' The Plague, the hero is a doctor selflessly dedicated to fighting disease, but quite incapable of believing in a God who would let plague-stricken children die in agony. Likewise, Bertolt Brecht found the horrors of war incompatible with a belief in divine providence. Though steeped in the Bible, he makes mock and sport of piety in Mother Courage, which dramatizes a war that took place during the very years in which Milton grew to maturity. When the chaplain says to Mother Courage at one point, "Tell yourself we're in the hands of God," she says simply, "I don't think we're that bad off." Questions about the efficacy of divine providence inevitably surface in time of war, and they remind us that along with man's relation to God, man's addiction to war plays a central role in the history of literature and of historiography, the writing of history itself. Part 2 of this course includes lectures on two ancient Greek historians, Herodotus and Thucydides, because in their time, history was just beginning to split off from literature, which was often based on historical events such as the Trojan War. Like the epics of Homer and Virgil, the first works of history spring from war. In his histories of the Persian Wars, Herodotus explains why the Persians fought with the Greeks in the early 5th century BC. From Thucydides' history of the Peloponnesian War, we learn how Athens fought with Sparta in the late 5th century BC. Both of these historians take their cue, so to speak, from the theme of Homer's Iliad, an epic poem that grows out of prehistoric legends about the war between the Greeks and the Trojans in the 12th century BC. And when Virgil sits down in the latter part of the 1st century BC to tell the story of how the Roman Empire came to be founded, he too returns to the Trojan War and announces his theme in the very first words of his poem, Arma virumque cano, I sing of war and a man of war. As a topic of literature, fighting never dies. Even the quickest survey of great works written since the classical era shows how persistent and pervasive it is. Beowulf, an Anglo-Saxon epic written around the year 800, tells how its title hero fights and kills a series of monsters. The Song of Roland, written in French about 100 years later, is an epic tale of Muslims fighting Christians led by Charlemagne. In the late 16th and early 17th centuries, many of the plays of Shakespeare touch upon war, as Hamlet does, and war dominates some of his history plays, such as Henry V, where the English win a glorious victory over the French. Later in the 17th century, Milton too makes war a part of Paradise Lost, though he chiefly aims to tell a story of moral conflict between sin and goodness, especially in Satan's temptation of Adam and Eve. Book 6 of Milton's epic tells the story of a spectacular war in heaven between Satan's rebellious army and the angels loyal to God, with Christ emerging as a triumphant warrior at the end. Up through the 17th century, great works of literature tend to represent war as a heroic enterprise, especially when described from the vantage point of the victors. Virgil begins the Aeneid by telling how the Trojan prince Aeneas was driven out of Troy when it was sacked and burned by the invading Greeks. But his ultimate aim is to tell how Aeneas came to Italy, fought his way to power there, and thus initiated the line that led to the triumph of Augustus and the Roman Empire. In Shakespeare's Henry V, as in Milton's Paradise Lost, the playwright and the poet stress the glorious consequences of war. But in the literature of the 18th century, faith in the glory of war begins to disintegrate right along with faith in divine providence and the mindless optimism of Voltaire's Candide, the vapid notion, the fatuous notion that all is for the best in this best of all possible worlds. In Gulliver's Travels, Swift treats war as savage, murderous, wantonly destructive, and wholly irrational. In later literature, war fares scarcely better. When England and its European allies defeated Napoleon at the Battle of Waterloo in 1815, Wordsworth wrote an ode of thanksgiving. But in Part 3 of Childe Harold's Pilgrimage, written in 1816, Byron denounced the battle as a bloody slaughter leading only to what he called a king-making victory that restored all the monarchies overthrown by Napoleon. In the 1860s, Tolstoy's War and Peace tells the story of a war that devastates Russia, even as it fatally enervates the Grand Army of Napoleon. And in the 20th century, great literature turns decisively against war. In James Joyce's Ulysses, written during the years of the First World War, Homer's ancient Greek warrior is reborn as the pacifist Leopold Bloom, who denounces war as fundamentally antithetical to life itself. In Virginia Woolf's Mrs. Dalloway, Septimus Smith is a distinguished veteran of the First World War, but he kills himself because he's been traumatized by the death in battle of a man he loved. In Bertolt Brecht's Mother Courage, written just as World War II began, the 30 Years' War leaves Germany devastated, just as the Second World War would do. And in Albert Camus' The Plague symbolizes all that is worst about war, its seemingly relentless, inexorable, uncontrollable power to kill. Along with war and man's relation to God, the other great enduring theme of great literature is, of course, love. Homer's Iliad tells the story of the Trojan War, but the war itself was ignited when the Trojan prince Paris abducted Helen, the ravishingly beautiful wife of the Greek king Menelaus. The Odyssey is the story of a warrior's homecoming, but also the story of his love affairs along the way and ultimately of his return to the wife who has lovingly waited for him at his home in Ithaca. Virgil's Aeneid is likewise the story of a warrior, but it includes the tragic story of his passionate affair with Dido, the Carthaginian queen. And in Ovid's Metamorphoses, transformation often springs from desire or the urge to thwart it, as when Daphne turns into a laurel to escape the passionate Apollo. Through the history of literature, love drives the great epics quite as much as war does. In the Divine Comedy, Dante's love of the dead Beatrice starts him on his visionary journey through hell and purgatory and finally draws him up to the heights of heaven, where he finds his beloved seated with the Virgin Mary. In Milton's Paradise Lost, Adam disobeys God because he is overpowered by his love for Eve. In Tolstoy's War and Peace, Prince Andrei's death on the battlefield is all the more poignant because of his love for Natasha. And in Joyce's Ulysses, a 20th century recreation of Homer's Odyssey, nothing is more powerful than the love that flows between Leopold and Molly Bloom. In my own lectures on the 19th century novel, I have argued that novels such as Jane Austen's Pride and Prejudice and Charles Dickens' Great Expectations radically rewrite the plot of romance, in which a handsome prince ends up marrying a beautiful princess. In the world of 19th century fiction, mating is regulated by socio-economic conditions that may frustrate desire indefinitely, or lead a young woman to marry a man whom she does not love at all. Also, as we move through the 19th century into the 20th, novelists increasingly shift their focus from the thrills of courtship to the pains of marriage. Adultery drives the plot in two of the greatest novels of the 19th century, Stendhal's Red and Black and Flaubert's Madame Bovary. And it likewise drives the plot in what is probably the greatest novel of the 20th century, James Joyce's Ulysses. God, war, and love. Working separately or collaborating, these three themes permeate Western literature from Homer to Joyce and beyond, and their persistence gives us some idea of what you gain by cultivating a sense of the past. The more you know about the history of literature, the more you will get from any book you read. Joyce's Ulysses perfectly exemplifies this point. Though barely mentioned in my lecture on Joyce, it tells us something of what Stephen Dedalus does after making his debut in the novel I did talk about, Portrait of the Artist as a Young Man. I must also say again that I've given another set of teaching company lectures just on Ulysses. For now, let me say that Ulysses breathes a historical sense. Linking ancient and modern, it recreates the episodes of Homer's Odyssey in the events of a single 20th century day in the life of a Dubliner named Leopold Bloom. To see Bloom as the reincarnation of Homer's Odysseus, we need to know something about the Odyssey. We need to know that when Odysseus returns to his home after 20 years, he finds it usurped by men wasting his goods and boorishly courting his wife. Knowing this, we can imagine something of what Bloom feels when he goes out in the morning to shop and returns to find in the entryway a letter addressed to his wife from a notorious playboy named Blazes Boylan. Suddenly, Bloom becomes Odysseus. In spite of the great gulf between Homer's legendary voyager and Joyce's advertising canvasser wandering the streets of Dublin, Bloom's discovery of Boylan's letter is the first unmistakably Odyssean moment in the book. If you ask why Ulysses and many other great works of literature spring from the recreation of earlier works, it's partly because no writer works in a vacuum. Even if the writer seeks to create something totally new, he or she has to work with an inherited language, and language contains the history of the literature that has been made from it. At the end of the first chapter of Joyce's Ulysses, standing all by itself like a complete paragraph, comes the single word, usurper. In context, it denotes what Stephen Dedalus thinks about Buck Mulligan, who has usurped the role of a priest by conducting a mock mass, and who also seeks to usurp Stephen's literary ambitions by turning him into a wisecracking drunkard. But given the echoes of ancient Greece in this chapter, including thalata, the Greek word for sea, we may be reminded of the suitors in the Odyssey who tried to usurp the place of Odysseus as king of Ithaca and husband of Penelope. Also, since Stephen wears black and is haunted by the ghost of his mother, we may be reminded of the inky-suited Hamlet, haunted by the ghost of his father. Once king of Denmark, he was murdered by his own brother Claudius, who married the queen and usurped the kingship. The single word usurper thus links Mulligan to both the suitors in the Odyssey and the usurping Claudius of Shakespeare's Hamlet. Examples like this one help us to see what Eliot means by the historical sense. They help us to see how the past perseveres in the present, how great works from widely different periods of literature may converge within the mind of a writer and assume a new order. In taking the plot of Homer's Odyssey as a template for the story of one man's day in a modern city, Joyce is not playing an esoteric trick on us. He is organizing his material. He's taking a single day in the life of a modern man and shaping it in such a way as to let us see the timeless, epic interaction of journeying and homecoming, work and play, youth and age, grief and laughter, love and jealousy, life and death. When we speak of shaping and ordering material in literature, we inevitably raise the question of what is meant by literary form. If you were suddenly asked to answer this question, the first thing that might pop into your head is the difference between poetry and prose. But verse and prose can work together, as they often do in the plays of Shakespeare. Furthermore, poetry can do without rhyme or even a regular meter, as in the works ranging from the Bible to Walt Whitman's free-flowing Song of Myself. And some contemporary poems, many contemporary poems, look exactly like prose on the printed page. So the question is this: if the distinction between poetry and prose won't really help us, can we find a better way of talking about literary form, of distinguishing one literary form from another? The first task we face is to fix the boundaries of literature itself, which is no easy task. Offhand, most people would say that literature means poetry, fiction, and plays, or, in other words, creative writing, imaginative stuff. But a number of the works covered in this course don't readily fit this definition. The Old and New Testaments are notoriously hard to classify, straddling as they do the lines between history, literature, and myth. Herodotus and Thucydides wrote histories based on current or near-current events. But as I've already noted, their works date from a time when the writing of history was just beginning to split off from the writing of epic. Thucydides, you may recall, feels perfectly free to invent the speeches that he puts into the mouths of historical characters to imagine what they might have said. Now, if Thucydides makes it hard to draw the line between literature and history in ancient Greece, Plato makes it hard for us to draw the line between literature and philosophy. Besides putting his philosophy into the dramatic form of dialogues, Plato creates a super talker named Socrates, who is just as much a dramatic character as the figure called Socrates in Aristophanes' comedy, The Clouds. Moving on from ancient Greece, we find further examples of work that straddles or just plain crosses the border between creative writing and other kinds. In the 1st century A.D., after Sallust and Livy had written their histories of Rome, Plutarch wrote his parallel lives of Greeks and Romans, thus initiating what we now call biography. In the 4th century, the Confessions of Augustine initiate autobiography, something we find again in the 18th century Confessions of Rousseau, who was a novelist as well as a political theorist, and who gives the shape of fiction to the fascinating story of his life. In the 16th century, Michel de Montaigne invents the philosophic essay of self-exploration, leading the way to the pensées or thoughts of Blaise Pascal in the 17th century, and in the following century to the essays of Samuel Johnson. In the 18th century as a whole, the spirit of the Enlightenment not only opened up new avenues of inquiry in science, philosophy, religion, politics, and the arts, it also begot new kinds of writing, exemplified by the extraordinarily wide-ranging articles in the Encyclopedia published by Denis Diderot. So how do we find our way through this forest? Looking at all these examples of writing that don't readily fit into the normal boundaries of literature, what can we say about literary forms? I suggest that we draw back from the boundaries where disputes so often rage and focus instead on the heartland of literature, where its most enduring forms can be found. For a little help at this point, I turn to Stephen Dedalus, who first appeared as the title figure in Joyce's Portrait of the Artist as a young man. In Chapter 5 of this novel, Stephen divides the world of literature into 3 categories: lyric, narrative, and dramatic. The lyrical form, he says, is in fact the simplest verbal vesture of an instant of emotion, a rhythmical cry such as ages ago cheered on the man who pulled the oar or dragged stones up a slope. He who utters it is more conscious of the instant of emotion than of himself as feeling emotion. The simplest epical form is seen emerging out of lyrical literature when the artist prolongs and broods upon himself as the center of an epical event, till the center of emotional gravity is equidistant from the artist and from others. The narrative is no longer purely personal. The personality of the artist passes into the narrative itself. The dramatic form is reached when the vitality which has flowed and eddied around each person fills every person with such vital force that he or she assumes a proper and intangible aesthetic life. The personality of the artist, at first a cry or a cadence or a mood, and then a fluid and lambent narrative, finally refines itself out of existence, depersonalizes itself, so to speak. This neat little story of the origins of literary form is largely Stephen's invention, for we have no evidence that lyric, narrative, and drama came along in that order. While the epic narratives of Homer are generally dated to the 8th century BC, the first important lyrics were written in the 7th and 6th centuries BC by Greek poets ranging from Alcaeus to Sappho. Through the festivals of Dionysus, lyric and epic together lead the way to drama in the 5th century BC, when we get the tragedies of Aeschylus, Sophocles, and Euripides, and the comedies of Aristophanes. So Stephen is not a fully reliable guide to the history of literature. But whether or not he is, whether or not we can say for certain just how these 3 forms emerged, the division of literature into lyric, narrative, and drama remains permanently useful. Once we grasp the point that lyric poetry is typically the expression of personal feeling, we can recognize it in work ranging from the 7th century BC to the 20th century AD. In the Greek lyrics of Alcaeus and Sappho, in the Roman lyrics of Catullus and Horace, in the 14th century canzoniere of Petrarch, in the 16th century sonnets of Shakespeare, in the introspective lines of Wordsworth's Tintern Abbey, and Yeats's Lake Isle of Innisfree, and Robert Frost's Stopping by Woods on a Snowy Evening. Unlike lyric, which voices the feeling of just one person and which often speaks directly for the author, drama speaks with many voices and thus conceals or at least obscures the personality of the author. This is one reason why biographers have such a trouble getting a grip on the personality of Shakespeare. With scanty information about the man himself, we have little more than the plays, which speak with 1,000 different voices. In the last act of Merchant of Venice, for instance, Portia sings the praises of mercy just before mercilessly destroying Shylock, who has earlier begged us to remember that he too is a human being. Can we know for certain which one of them speaks for Shakespeare, or even assume that either one of them does? As a literary form, drama thrives on conflict, on the multiplication of viewpoints. When we see The Merchant of Venice, or Molière's Tartuffe, or Wilde's The Importance of Being Earnest, or Brecht's Mother Courage, we are not hearing anything directly from the playwright. We are watching and listening to his characters as they act and speak for themselves. Between the subjectivity of the lyric and the impersonality of drama falls the literary form called narrative, which is probably the oldest of them all. Narrative is storytelling. And since we all love to tell and hear stories, it should hardly surprise us that narrative has lasted so long, from the ancient epic to the modern novel. Notice, by the way, that epics are typically written in verse, while novels are typically written in prose. But to compare the epics of Homer with Joyce's Ulysses or Melville's Moby Dick is to see that the difference between verse and prose is far less important than the persistence of narrative form. I say this even while recognizing that the movement from the ancient epic to the modern novel tells us a great deal about the history of literature. We can trace this history with the aid of a Canadian critic, a late Canadian critic, I should say, by the name of Northrop Frye, who has classified literary narratives according to the power of action exercised by the main character. In epic, or what he calls the high mimetic mode, the author depicts or mimics a man of high station, such as Odysseus, king of ancient Ithaca. Homer's hero is superior to other men and capable of extraordinary feats, like escaping from the cave of a monster or shooting an arrow from a bow that no one else can draw. But as epic gives way to the novel, we move downward from the high mimetic to the low mimetic mode, where the hero is an ordinary man or woman, no better than the rest of us. The novel originates in ancient Greece as a love story in which two young people meet, are separated, undergo various trials, and are finally reunited. In medieval and Renaissance versions of this plot, which is the plot of romance, the hero may perform fabulous feats like killing dragons to win the hand of his beloved. But when the novel is reborn in the 18th century, the fabulous plot of romance is ground up in the mill of socio-economic realism, wherein marriage depends not so much on love and heroism as on money, property, and social status. The protagonists of such novels, men and women alike, seem no more powerful than the rest of us. And in 20th century novels, such as Joyce's Ulysses, the protagonist can seem even weaker than the rest of us, caught up in a net of frustration from which he can see no escape. Even knowing that his wife plans to entertain her lover at 4 p.m. on Bloomsday, Leopold Bloom feels powerless to stop it. Will happen. Yes, he tells himself. Prevent. Useless. Can't move. Useless to move now. Eschewing the violent revenge that Homer's Odysseus took upon the men who dared to besiege his wife, Bloom must find a subtler, more cerebral way to regain possession of his wife and home. So we come at last to the middle of the 20th century, and to a whole new set of writers, makers of contemporary literature. They remind us that the story of literature never ends, that it is always being reinvented, recreated, and rewritten. And even if we had been able to include in this series all the great authors of Western literature, we could do little more than introduce you to each of them. Collectively, we have aimed not only to plunge you into the works of each author, but also to show you how each new author grapples with the literature of the past, even as he or she tries to forge something new. For the beauty of great literature is that it never goes out of date. As Ezra Pound once said, literature is news that stays news.
We genuinely hope you've enjoyed these lectures from our Great Courses series. Our courses are available to order online. Visit our website at www.teach12.com or call our customer care representatives at 1-800-TEACH12. That's 1-800-TEACH12. Thank you very much.